let's dive right into the big news of last week. I mean, the internet kind of exploded in the baseball world here, where MLB announced that the Negro League stats are officially going to enter the MLB record books. Um, a lot of mixed, I mean, it's either black or white here. You're either on the left or the right of this issue. There's no really in between. You're either for the records going into the books or you're completely against it. Um, that being said, I'm kind of on the fence. Like as weird as that might sound, but
I'm with you.
um, I I am for the integration of the record. These guys deserve all the recognition in the world, and I get the argument that people are like, "Oh, well, now it opens up to the Japanese stats coming into MLB." No, no, like they have their own league. The Nippon Baseball League has their own league that these guys were all allowed to play in. Here in America, they were not allowed to play with whites. So therefore, they had to form this league in order to play baseball. And before we even get to that point of it, MLB had recognized all the other leagues before that. Like in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, they had already put all those leagues into the MLB record books and left the Negro League stats. I believe that happened in 1969 is when they did that. So they still were segregating the Negro Leagues, being like, no, that it's not going to happen. MLB in 2020 officially elevated the Negro Leagues to major league status. To me, right then, that's when the records should have gone in the record books. If you're elevating that league to an MLB status, then those records need to be counted. So like I don't know. Like what is your first initial thought on all of this?
Yeah, well, I've got a bunch of issues with this, and the first one comes down to what MLB did. So what you're talking about is exactly where my head goes. In 2020, during the pandemic, when the world wasn't paying attention, MLB goes, "Hey, by the way, the Negro Leagues are now considered major league level." Surprise! Nobody, I don't think most fans even caught that. There
Right.
was no press release, there was no announcement, there was no like MLB Network special. Like it was just like I think they posted on their Facebook page, sent out a quick press release, and moved on. The world wasn't listening. So that's my first problem. MLB does this, tells nobody, basically tells nobody. And then they come around on a random Tuesday afternoon in May of 2024 and say, "Hey, by the way, we're going to integrate the record books too." And oh, because of that, we're going to have a bunch of long-standing major league records that get overwritten with new holders of those records. To which we all say, "What?" Like on a random Tuesday in May, we're gonna do this, and literally MLB didn't even announce it. It leaked, like it
Yeah.
leaked to a series of media outlets that reported it. So, in typical MLB fashion, they, I think, had good intentions. I think this is the right thing to do. Starting off, I think elevating the Negro Leagues, although not necessary, I think it needed to be done just to prove to people that it belonged at that status.
Yeah.
It already was in most people's minds, but it needed the official elevation. And then putting the records in there, just you have to acknowledge the fact that these players had stats. These players did some pretty incredible things that most people have no idea about. But where MLB misses it is this was MLB's chance to unveil this big change and talk about the Negro Leagues and highlight the Negro Leagues and tell the story of the Negro Leagues and give people the reason why. Ec- Celebrate the Negro Leagues with this. Instead, MLB just throws out a press release, sticks the records in there, and goes, "Hey, look what we did."
Yeah.
They completely miss it time and again. Rob Manfred is so tone deaf to the fan that it's frustrating.
Yeah.
This should have been an event. They should have done it like at the All-Star break or between the championship series and the World Series. Like this should have been an event. It should have been a big announcement, a big splash, a special, a conversation, an unveiling. Instead, it's a press release at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in May when nobody's paying any attention and they wonder why the fans are all riled up. Nobody knows what you just did or why you did it. And MLB just continues to swing and miss at opportunities to promote the game and its history.
Yeah. And they're not putting in all the statistics here. Let's they have
Yeah.
done they have done
Most people don't even understand that fact. Like another part of it.
right, right. They have done their research. It's not like they're like, "Ah, yeah, we're just gonna throw the stats in there." No, they've had historians go back through. They're from what I've read, they're not counting the barnstorming, the exhibitions. That's why Josh Gibson's only getting credited for what is it, 238 home
Like, yeah,
runs,
230 something.
right?
Yep.
They said he's probably close to 800 in his career, like counting barnstorming and all of those other exhibition games too. These are only the stats that they can officially validate, right? They're not
Yep.
just throwing in stats willy nilly. These are all. I mean, like I have some others, like they're adding. Satchel Paige now has the third best single season ERA at 1.01 in 1944. And his career victory total from 28 to 124. So that's kind of a significant jump. But they're going to count from Mays has some more hits in that first season with the
Yep.
Barons that they're going to count. So Jackie Robinson has 49 more career hits, and Minnie Minoso 150 hits, puts him over the 2,000 hit threshold. So, like, they're not entering every single stat that these guys ever played in.
Right. Well, and the sad part is that the stats that were kept are relatively incomplete. They don't know how many strikeouts Josh Gibson had. They know how many walks he might have had, but they don't know how many strikeouts he had. They know roughly what his batting average is, but they can't really truly verify some of the stuff. And what people don't realize, again, because MLB didn't tell them, is when they announced they're elevating the Negro Leagues in 2020, they began this project. They've been working for the last 3 years. They've got a group of statisticians that work together to validate every possible stat they could, and they took 3 years to do that before they unveiled this thing.
Right.
So it's not like they just grab whatever clippings they could and said, boom, here's the new stat book. No, it was, we're going to go through and validate everything we can. And in fairness, they threw the barnstorming games out, which you could argue maybe you shouldn't. I mean, the reality of it is the Negro Leagues, there were not that many teams. These guys played 50 to 60 games a year. I mean, Josh Gibson's career, he only has credit for like 600 games played
Right.
in 14 years. I mean,
Right.
they're playing 50 to 60 games a year. And to fill the schedule, they would travel and they would go find other local teams. Those local teams might have been nothing more than maybe like a men's league in what we would call today's terms, but they played as many games as they could because they didn't have enough teams to make a full schedule. So these guys went to these tournaments and these events and these barnstorming things where they would just go out and find teams to play and they'd play.
Right.
It may have looked a lot like pickup baseball, but that's all they had. So I get not including those stats because you definitely weren't playing major league caliber level players. But at the same time, like you're also taking away a piece of the body of work where these guys had to go find games to play. Otherwise, there would have been no reason for the Negro Leagues to exist. There weren't enough games there to keep these guys busy.
Yeah. I I love the argument where it's like, I think I threw a comment in there somewhere and it was like, you know, Babe Ruth wouldn't necessarily Babe Ruth if it was integrated. And Babe Ruth himself had said that. He's like, I may not be the best player in the world. Like there might be other guys that we have no idea of their talent. And he was pretty vocal about integration during his time playing. Like he was all
Right.
for it. I don't know. I get it. Like you said, not the highest level, but they did what they had to because they weren't allowed to play at the highest level.
Right. Yeah. It's true. And there's been a ton of articles. They've been in the Athletic, the New York Times. They've been all over, I've seen stuff on CNBC and NBC and all everywhere. Reverend Al Sharpton saying the timing of this is disgusting and is tone deaf, which I agree with.
Yeah.
Other groups saying that MLB didn't have to do this because they've already elevated the Negro Leagues, or people saying to put asterisks on the record so that they stand out so people can see these were Negro League players. People saying put asterisk on the stats because they really don't know if they can believe them or consider them equivalent. So people are all over the place on this. Where I understand the argument is when you say, well, they didn't play in the same league. They didn't play against the same competition. They didn't play in the same conditions. And I would argue that argument works both ways. If you put Josh Gibson on the New York Yankees in a great lineup in a great ballpark with better equipment and all the stuff, he might have been better. We just don't know.
Right.
But I get the argument of, was the competition level the same? We don't know. Were the conditions the same? We don't know. Like, we just don't know. We don't know enough about it. So I get the argument of, can you really compare these side by side, or is it apples and oranges? And I feel that way to a certain extent. But when you really think about it, those Negro League players may have actually put up better stats in better conditions. So you can't make that argument and not think about the other side of it, where that would have been actually a benefit to the Negro League players to be able to travel and play a full season and have better teammates and better conditions and better equipment and better everything.
Yeah.
So I get that argument, and I find myself almost talking myself out of it, because there's two sides to that. But I think you have to acknowledge that these players, they had stats, they played games, they are very talented. And unfortunately, we're in this position because as a country and society, we just weren't smart enough to realize back in the 30s and 40s what we were doing.
Right.
You know, this seemed right at the time, and you look back, you realize it's wrong. And the biggest regret is that I really wish you could have seen what some of these players would have done in Major League Baseball.
1,000% agree. I would have given you guys know how I felt about Josh Gibson. I've loved Josh Gibson. I have him as my best all-time catcher when we first started the show 3 years ago, and Sean was giving me a whole bunch of grief for it. But as it shows, like, the stats that they are letting in shows like what kind of player this guy was. There could be the best of all time. But again, like, to your argument, we just don't know.
Right.
Like, and that's the hard part of this. But I saw some other interesting comments that I'm just going to share, like, throughout the whole, reading through the comment section and seeing what all these nuts have to say. But I saw one: if Negro League stats shouldn't count, then no stats before integration should count. We want to pretend like racism didn't exist, then we wipe the slate before integration. And I was like,
that's the other side of the argument. If you don't want to count the Negro League stats, then why should you count anything else? If you're going to argue they didn't play in the same league, well, you can argue that on the other direction. What if Major League hitters had to face Satchel Paige all those years?
Right.
I don't know. I think that you can't take a one-sided view of this, because there's a lot to dig into here. Because were the leagues the same? No.
You can take a one-sided view. It's just not.
Yeah, you sound ridiculous, but yes, you can.
Yeah.
You absolutely can.
So now Josh Gibson is now the career average leader, 372 ahead of Ty Cobb. Slugging percentage 718 ahead of Babe Ruth, and OPS a 1.177 ahead of Ruth. Those are also all single season records in those three categories.
Yes, and his 466 average in 1943 is now the highest single season average in baseball history as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I get it. Like, it's been a long time coming, and these guys, like I said at the top of the show, like, they need the recognition. Like, these guys weren't slouches. I mean, they just weren't allowed to play because whites kept them out. And don't give me that argument again. Like I said, that it now opens the books for, like, Japanese player stats and all that stuff. No, they had their own separate league. They were allowed to play. These guys weren't. And that's what it comes down to. We said, no, you can't come play with us because you're black. And that's that. So they had to form their own thing in order to play.
Right.
Like, that's your mistake.
It is. I mean, it's a sad aspect of history that, you have to reconcile the best you can. Another great example is Barry Bonds' single season 863 slugging percentage record in 2001. He now falls to fifth,
right,
behind 4 Negro League players, who will step in front of him. So, a lot of your baseball purists are going, well, so all of a sudden Barry Bonds is fifth. Well, he might have always been fifth. We were chasing the wrong benchmark because we didn't know.
Well, and let's be honest, a lot of people don't even recognize that stat anyways, because of the whole steroid thing. So you can't talk out of both sides of your mouth there. Yeah. You can't say, you can't take Barry Bonds off the record book. Well, you don't even count his all-time career home run records because, steroids, which is also another tired argument, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. But you can't talk out of both sides of your mouth there.
MLB needs to cleanse that mistake too, but that's a whole nother argument for another day. But so when you when you kind of run down the road a little further, MLB's been working on this for 3 years. This was not just randomly done and thrown together. It's been a 3-year research project. The stats are still in the process of being integrated. They're not fully integrated yet. And the full MLB statistical database will become public on June 20th,
June 20th.
before the Cardinals and Giants play a tribute game to the Negro Leagues at Rickwood Field in Birmingham, Alabama. So this is still happening. It's still in process. You're still 2 weeks away from having the final results. But they will make all these stats public, and they will or public here on the 20th. They will also be going into the Cooperstown plaques to update any players that are now getting stats from the Negro Leagues. Willie Mays, Minnie Minoso, other players are picking up stats, Jackie Robinson, from time they spent in the Negro Leagues.
Yep.
And then finishing making plaques that are missing for players that had some of these major milestones. So there's a lot of other stuff to happen here, but ultimately, this work has been done. It's been vetted. It's been approved by Major League Baseball. A whole committee went through it, and it, effectively goes live on June 20th.
Yeah, and the fact they're like, oh, we'll just leave it alone. History is history. Okay, I kind of agree with that argument. Yes, history is history. But after reading through the comments, we haven't made any progress as a country. to be completely honest, we haven't. And have we made some? Of course we have. Let's we have. But you can rectify that mistake. And this is the first step in that, for sure. And doing these tribute games at Rickwood Field, that, I can't wait for that. I think that's going to be an awesome event.
Yeah, that'll be cool.
Yeah. Because we've seen those specialty games, like the Little League World Series games that they brought to Pennsylvania, the Field of Dream games. At first we were like, are these gimmicky? What are these going to look like? But they turned out to be pretty damn awesome. I love them. So I really hope that they do the Rickwood Field game justice, which I think they will. When they do these games, it's a big production. They go down through the history of it, which we all love. Baseball's so old that we all love the history of the game.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the integration of these stats to the MLB record books is where it's what needs to happen, for sure.
Well, and I think one of the things that makes baseball so great is that it has such a long, rich history. There's no other sport that goes back officially as far as Major League Baseball does. Football's got some history, but half what MLB has, maybe not even half what MLB has. Hockey's got some history. Basketball's got some history, but no league goes back into the 1800s like MLB does. Right. And that's the beauty of baseball. It has been around for so long, and stats have been kept for so long, and there's such a deep, rich history of people and stadiums and stories that I think that's one of the things that makes baseball special. It also makes baseball really hard. Right. And we debate this on the show all the time. What would Babe Ruth do in today's game? What would Aaron Judge do in that game? What kind of player would Willie Mays be today? We have these arguments all the time, and you don't know. And the argument's always, well, they played in different times, different conditions, blah, blah, blah. Same argument for the Negro Leagues. They also played in different conditions and different times, and even their counterparts in the same era. Era to era, this game's hard to judge. Right. But even in the same era, they had the same thing. The game of baseball, and this is where some people are making the argument, the game of baseball is the same everywhere, largely. And that's people are saying, well, if you're going to make the Negro Leagues, then you should make the leagues in Japan and China. And all. No, well, yes, it's the same game. I understand. I can appreciate that, but it's not the same game.
It's not an American league. It's not a league that was formed in America.
Right. They might be playing the same game, but it's not the same game necessarily. There are nuances. There's also a geographical difference. There's league differences. There's different standards. I mean, it's not the same. No. But the Negro Leagues is one of the closest things we have to a parallel at the time, because those players were, in most cases, major league quality players that just weren't allowed to play.
Yeah.
So they had to form their own league, which arguably you could say is probably pretty close talent-wise, maybe not as deep, but your top end was probably all equivalent to the top end of Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
It's an easier comparison to make, and it's easier to say, were they different? Yes. But are they close enough you can compare them? Also, yes.
Right.
The issue that I always had was, how do you verify the stats? And MLB finally did the work to do that and validate whatever they could. It is a shame that Josh Gibson's home run stats are going to end up where they end up. I can appreciate why, but the
Right.
stories of Josh Gibson and the aura of Josh Gibson was that he was this nearly 800 home run hitter, and we're not going to see that.
Yeah.
But I understand why.
Right. But then you can still recognize that in the history of the game. You know, you can still say that. Like
Yeah.
in his career, he could have hit close to 800 home runs, but stats just weren't
I
verified back then. Like you
I
can
would
still appreciate the history of it.
I would love to see MLB come back and revise the stats. Not necessarily revise the stats, but add exhibition stats. So maybe Josh Gibson in the history books gets credit for 238. But maybe you can show from all these exhibition games that he had the 800. Like maybe you can tell the whole story of Josh Gibson. You don't have to give him credit for it in the record books,
Right.
but at least give him, it's almost like tracking spring training stats. They don't count for anything, but you can look back and say, hey, a guy in his career had this many spring training home runs because we keep stats for everything.
So same thing with postseason stats, which blows
Yeah,
my mind.
right.
Like career home run totals don't count. Like postseason home runs don't count to your career totals, which is nuts to me. Like it's just mind blowing. That's like, all right, well, that's
Yeah,
still your career. Like you're still putting home runs in the postseason, but they don't count towards your
yeah.
career home run total. It's
Good point.
weird.
Postseason 2 all-star games. Like,
Yeah.
these guys have played a lot more games than their stat line says. So I'd love to see him at some point in time come back and tell more of the Negro League story through stats, but I understand how they got to where they got to.
Yeah.
I still believe MLB has to come back and right the wrong of not making this a big event and not doing a big unveiling and not educating baseball fans on the Negro Leagues, not telling the story of the leagues, of the players, of what happened.
Yeah.
By just making the announcement, they're doing such a massive injustice to these players in these leagues by just saying, hey, look what we did. But like, give us more. Tell us why.
Right.
Celebrate this moment.
Yeah.
Don't just fire off a press release and check the box that you did it.
Yeah. So as you know, I play MLB The Show like yearly, religiously. This year and last year they released Negro League storylines, and they
Cool.
have like you can go through and play specific moments of these guys' career. And in between each moment that you play or you try to recreate, there's a historian that sits and tells the story of like the game, the guy's career, like and it's really cool. Like I sit there and like almost watch it like a movie. Like it's really cool. It's interesting to me. Being the baseball nerd that I am, I love all that stuff. I love the history of the game. It's about time that MLB, recognize these guys as equals. It's the first correct step in that process.
Yeah, and but admittedly, it's a difficult step. I
For
still
sure.
struggle.
For sure.
I still struggle with the fact that many of the the records that I've known and come to appreciate aren't the records anymore.
Right.
Josh Gibson's going to hold a lot of records now. Other
Yeah.
players are going to hold some records that were previously held by other players that I considered to be, kind of on the Mount Rushmore of baseball. That maybe they still are, but it causes the fans to kind of have to look back, and history's changed, and it's hard to wrap your brain around the fact that everything you thought you knew, you don't know anymore, and you've got to get used to what's now current.
Yeah, we've talked about like when Ty Cobb hit 466 or whatever in that single season. Like these guys were playing on fields that had molehills going across the infield. Like
Yep.
they weren't playing on the carpets that these guys play on now.
No,
So like,
not
how
the same.
many of those hard ground balls that Cobb hit a molehill and went? I just sound real Southern right there, but
Yeah, wicked bad.
It's so bad. Hit a molehill and ended up in the outfield for a base hit. Like where in today's game it's just a routine ground ball to second. Like we just don't know.
Yep, and you have to appreciate and respect the fact that the eras were different and the game
Right.
was different. And look at a guy like Ty Cobb from his era. Most of those guys worked in the off season because they didn't get paid anything.
Right.
These players today, they do baseball all the time. They've got strength and conditioning people, nutritionists. They got people that work on their mental makeup. Like they're flying chartered flights, staying in great hotels. Like these guys in the old days were getting paid nothing. They were eating crap. There was no workout.
On a bus.
On a bus or a train, staying in crap hotels with bats that were effectively nothing more than like a tree branch. And it's not the same. But as the game has evolved, the game has changed. And as fans, you have to be able to reflect that to a certain extent. And that's why, as much as people hate war to me is the only thing I can use to really benchmark a player against somebody from another era. It
Right.
tells me where you stood versus your peer group. Now, is it perfect? No.
No.
But how else do you compare Ty Cobb to Ken Griffey Jr.? I don't know. Like, there's
Right.
no good way. The game was different. Nobody
No.
hit like Ken Griffey Jr. back then, just like nobody hits like Ty Cobb today.
Yeah.
You know,
And
the game has changed.
I think it's important to know that or learn that fans need to evolve too. MLB is trying to evolve and it does it naturally. Like you said, over the eras, baseball evolves. And fans just seem to be stuck in the past. Like baseball is an old person's game, right? Old fans' games. Like, what's the average fan age? It's our age and above. Like,
Yeah.
that's just how it is. And people just don't evolve to anything new that involves baseball, and it's changed. Like keep it pure, keep baseball pure, and I understand that. Like to an extent, like yes, we need to keep baseball baseball, and there are rule changes aside. Like I think they've done a good job evolving with what needs to be addressed at the major league level. But fans aren't evolving with the game, which is also an issue in itself.
No, it's true. And you know, we was it a few weeks ago now, we had a discussion about, you know, when do past records and all that begin to not matter.
And championships,
And
yeah,
right. And that's one of the beauties of baseball is the fact that there are still Yankees fans that walk around the streets screaming 27 rings, and anybody that's under the age of 30 has been alive for one of them.
right,
But they're still going to chant 27 rings. Yeah. Most of them were before the 1950s, and there was no free agency, and there's all kinds of reasons why it worked that way.
right,
Um, but yeah, 27 rings in your history. Yeah, you've got 27 championships. But if you're under the age of 30, you've only been alive for one of them,
right,
um, or two of them maybe.
yeah,
But you haven't seen them all.
right,
And you know, thankfully for Red Sox fans, we've seen four recently. But still, like that history carries on, and it carries
yeah,
generation to generation. Does it become less relevant as time goes on? Sure, but it doesn't change the fact that it happened.
right, exactly. So just to put a bow on the whole thing, I'm glad that they're moving in this direction, and these players are getting the recognition they deserve. Because
Yeah,
yes, people knew of these guys, Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, and like you said, they have that aura around them. But now this is like officially like these guys were top of their class
yeah,
when they were playing, and I love it. I'm all about it.
yeah. And
So
what I would say is I'm all for the change. I wish MLB did a better job making this a big event and making it
yeah,
make helping the fans understand it. But I will say, if you're somebody like us that, you know, kind of struggles with the idea of what does this mean and how did it come to be and all that, like you're not alone. A lot of us are having the same kind of feeling of do I like it? Do I not? I don't know.
yeah,
There are the people that just outright hate it, the people that think it's the greatest thing ever. But it's okay to have the conversation about is this the way to handle it? Were the leagues the same? What was the competition level like? I mean, you, me, and Sean debated that for in circles for like an hour and a half
hours.
after it
Yeah,
came out because it's a fair question to ask. And these are the conversations that should be had. It shouldn't be a matter of it's a lesser league and blah, blah, blah. No, like the conversation's worth having. The debate is what makes this thing so great, but it's got to be a debate that's intelligent with context, not a debate of just, I don't like it because it's different.
yeah, and it's also the stats that they're including are only from 1920 to 1948. So anything before that and anything after that doesn't matter. So like yeah, it's a 30-year window ish, but it's still not the entire history that they're
It's not.
throwing in the MLB record books. So
Yep.
I think a lot of the, I mean, outrage for lack of better word was like you said, how they delivered it. Like, yes, it was leaked, but it was just like,
Right.
here, digest this, like chew on this cud for a little bit. Let's see how you guys react to it.
Yeah. We're going to rewrite history. Boom. What do you think?
Yeah, right.
It's like, what?
Yeah, it's like a leak they put out on purpose, but
Yeah.
which I think you said, right? It's like almost like they do this on purpose just to get a feel for what the fans are, how the fans are going to react.
Yeah. It was I think either me or Sean. It might have been Sean. I just made the comment of it feels like MLB leaked this just to like take the temperature of the fan base
Yeah,
before they actually make the big announcement. But there's really been no big announcement to follow. So it looks like that really was all there's going to be.
crazy, but typical MLB fashion. But
I
yeah,
just feel like they did everybody a disservice by not making this a bigger deal.
agree. And maybe they will. Maybe the Rickwood
Let's hope.
games is where it kind of like blows up and they make a big deal of it, which because they have the stage to do it there. Because
They do.
nationally, a lot of people are going to be tuning in for that.
Well,
So
yeah, this has gotten people's attention. That game on the 20th is probably going to have some decent ratings because people are going to be tuning in to know what's happening.
mhm, for sure.